Carl Lentz is fired from Hillsong East Coast. And I guess that's the only part of the story that matters. In today's episode, I'm going to discuss my thoughts on this Carl Lentz situation and what it means in the evangelical church. And I think it means a lot of things. I'm holding down the fort here for Drew as he gets used to baby at home. And he literally moved back to his home with baby, his new baby. And so he's adjusting to all that. So I'm holding down the fort here at the Provisionist Perspective. Let's dive in to the case of Carl Lentz. And I've got some thoughts here. So Carl Lentz was fired from Hillsong East Coast by Brian Houston, the global senior pastor of the International Hillsong Church. And in the original email that they sent out when they fired him, they said the email, which was obtained here, so that means one of them, somebody released it to them, cited reason for termination as leadership issues and breaches of trust, plus a recent revelation of moral failures. So moral failure can only really mean one thing. He cheated on his wife, and this is confirmed later on. We all know what happened here. And so he cheats on his wife. And then what I thought was interesting was the leadership failures. And that to me can only mean spiritual abuse. So we're going to talk about those two aspects of it. And then I want to also talk about the other aspect, which is kind of something broader, I think, within evangelical church, where we only really discuss men's sins. We don't ever discuss the sins of women. And I think this is very bad. I think it sends men away from the church and sends them into the hands of, well-meaning male authority figures, but people who aren't pointing them to Jesus Christ. So he is fired. And what I saw a lot going on was a lot of dunking on Carl Lentz. And I get it. I understand why my ilk, my people, the conservative Christians, would dunk on Carl Lentz. He gave that terrible abortion answer on The View. And overall, he's the pastor of a celebrity church. And so there can be this sense of, well, of course this happened to him. Of course. That response gives me the heebies. The reason this gives me the heebies is because Carl isn't alone in his temptation as a man and as a pastor. Just because he is the celebrity pastor in New York and he baptized Justin Bieber in Tyson Chandler's bathtub, apparently Carl and his wife Laura were very close with Justin and Haley Bieber, and this is probably going to harm their relationship. Carl Lentz is reaching a audience that a lot of us never could. And his struggles are not all that different from the pastor with his 60-person congregation in the middle of Texas or Iowa. The pastor who is worshiped and lionized by a congregation of any size is going to have these kind of temptations. So just because it would be perhaps a celebrity, or in this case, some sort of fashion designer who is throwing themselves at Carl Lentz or Carl Lentz is surrounded by, that doesn't change the fact that you're going to have these sorts of temptations. It's not just in these, highfalutin New York fashion designer circles where pastors are going to be tempted. Pastors are always going to be tempted with the power that they possess and with the admiration that comes with that. From lost souls, men looking for companionship and role models, women looking for companionship, and women knowing how to get that kind of companionship. So this is always going to be an issue, and the conservative church in the middle of Iowa is not immune from this. It's easy to dunk on Carl because Hillsong and because East Coast and all that, but I think that approach is counting your chickens before they hatch. Is that the counting your chickens before they hatch? it could happen to you. It could happen to your pastor. And that's one of the things is I actually got a few messages from people who were kind of bummed about this. I got both, like, yeah, of course this happened to Carl. But then also I got people who were bummed about this. And that's another aspect of this that I want to discuss for a minute. It's easy to personalize this. It's easy to look at somebody like Carl, who I don't agree with everything Carl says. In fact, I'm not all that familiar with Carl Lentz, to be honest with you. I've seen some of his stuff on leadership and on character, and some of it was really, really good. But I also saw his answer on The View, and it was too politically correct. He's just trying not to offend people, and I get it. He's reaching a population that I never could, that a lot of us never could. The rich and the famous in New York need Jesus just as much as we do, and he's reaching that population, and I don't think he should be dunked on for that. Now, but then we even so, however much we admired him or not, we could still personalize this, and we feel for his family, and we feel for what they must be going through, and we kind of say, "But for the grace of God, go I." It could be me. I could do that to my family, and it would destroy them and destroy my life, destroy their lives, and man, what they must be going through right now. I unfortunately, in doing a bit of research for this episode, went down some of the sordid details, and it just grieved me. It's awful. I can't imagine what they're going through. They sold their house in Jersey, and are they going to still live there? Are they going to have to move? They're going to move with their kids. They've been married since 2003. I believe her name is Laura, his wife. And they've been married since then. It's awful. I wouldn't want to go through that. But for the grace of God, go I. And so it's that can hurt us, somebody that we admire, or somebody that is in, and maybe even makes us a little bit angry because it's somebody who now makes Christianity look bad. A public figure who makes Christianity look bad. I think that says more about the version of Christianity we put out there than Carl himself. But it is, the case that now we have to provide an explainer for why it is that pastors fail and cheat. Something interesting here, though, is that Hillsong did something good. If I were to listen to my conservative Christian brethren, I would be being told that Hillsong is some kind of cult, and that they are they produce all these terrible songs. I personally find their songs beautiful. You just kind of put your brain away and enjoy them. You put your brain away and enjoy the music, enjoy what it means. Music is so subjective. You can enjoy it even if you don't enjoy the theology of the people who make it. If Hillsong is such a heretical church, would they care if one of their celebrity pastor cheated on his wife? Wouldn't they just kind of sweep it under the rug and keep him in his position? They're doing something good here. When they say leadership failures, that to me, and breaches of trust, that's spiritual abuse. At some level, Carl Lentz was a spiritual abuser. He lost his way long before he cheated on his wife, and he's been hurting people left and right. That sounds like, and this is supported by some other articles that show that Hillsong is taking this very seriously. Brian Houston announces on Twitter that they are launching an independent investigation into the inner workings of Hillsong East Coast. We need a solid foundation for a fresh start and a new beginning. The best is yet to come. So they're some New York-based legal firm, which it did not identify. So they are putting together a legal firm to address these breaches of trust and these apparently spiritual abuse that Carl Lentz was engaged in, and maybe some of his leadership team was engaged in. And if they're hiring a legal firm, that means, to me, maybe a lawyer can correct me in the comments here, but they're going to start paying people. They're going to offer some financial restitution or get ready for some lawsuits from what Carl was doing there, things that came to light. And so this is a good turn. I know conservative churches who just sweep these things under the rug, and they either kind of make these abusers and adulterers go away, and you never hear anything about it, or they elevate these guys, and they can't give up on their leadership capabilities. He was presiding, Carl Lentz was presiding over a massive church in New York City. He was the celebrity pastor, the two celebrities, and they fired him and they let go his wife, and they're done there. That's a good thing. And they are looking to make right the wrongs that he did over who knows how long. And it looks like maybe even through financial means. That's great. I wish smaller churches would do that. I wish that was the common approach when people are spiritually abused in the church and it comes to light. But instead, conservative churches especially can circle the wagons and protect the abuser and allow them to leave quietly out of respect for them and their families or something, and tell everyone to don't talk about it, and oh yeah, he's gone, and oh yeah, or they cover it for it completely. Nobody knows, and everyone's told to get over it, and the guy is still in leadership. Those are the common things that I see happen. I know church is happening too right now. So it's that Hillsong is putting in an independent firm and taking this seriously, maybe even paying people, is a very good thing. And even if we disagree with how the music a organization produces or some of their theology, if we can't say that something they're doing is good, then we're the biased ones. Then we are the ones with the problem. We're the ones who cannot see something good or see the truth when it presents itself. If we're evaluating where the moral act comes from, where the good thing comes from, and then deciding it can't be good just because it comes from Hillsong, that makes us the biased ones. We should be praising their approach to this, not just letting him go, but seeming to want to make it right. The other aspect of this that really concerns me, and this is something that I've had my eyes open to recently, something that seems widespread in evangelicalism. And after you hear about this, you're going to see it everywhere. I mean, it is everywhere. And that is, we can only talk about men's particular sins, but we don't ever talk about women's particular sins. The only outlet that I know of that is currently having this conversation is Theopolis, Peter Leithart's Theopolis Institute. They are currently taking a look at the effects of the manosphere in the church and wondering why it is that so many men are drawn to figures like Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan. I enjoy both those guys very much. I appreciate a lot of what they have to say, but they aren't pointing people to Jesus, and they aren't placing men in the church around other wise, supportive men as they go through their lives and the difficulties of their lives. They're not pointing them to those things, but what are they doing? They are basically saying it's a good thing to be a man, whereas in the evangelical church, men are constantly derided. Let's take a look at an article from Theopolis here. This phenomena is recorded in a book called The Death of the Christian Britain by Colin Brown. And in it, Brown notes a shift in public perception of piety around 1800 from a male register to a female register. He points out, for example, how angels shifted from being portrayed as primarily male to being portrayed as mostly as female around that time. Brown surveyed the evangelical literature of that era, finding that men and masculinity came to be seen as acute threats to holiness and the home, while women and femininity became associated with godliness. Now, I think this is just 100% true. This is obviously true, this next paragraph here. In evangelical stories about piety, women appeared throughout as good, but not always converted. Men, by contrast, always appeared as in a perilous sinful state until near the end. Men were the problem, given manifold temptations, drink, always gambling, increasingly after 1890, and rough in overall cultural terms. They lived dissipated lives, which caused suffering and ruination to mothers, wives, and children. Nowhere did evangelical literature have such a powerful influence in the public domain, including in secular fiction, as in its demonization of men. Now, this may take different forms today, but I think this is absolutely demonstrably true, that whenever you have examples of sin, you have examples from the pulpit and in popular Christian literature, the examples of bad things, sinful things, are always at a male register, like this article says. They're almost always particularly male things: sexual aggression, violence, gambling, drinking. Things, and women are not portrayed as the instigators of sin, but always the victims of sin. This is true even now. And you can look at popular conservative pastors, how sometimes brutalize men from their pulpits. For example, consider Matt Chandler, the A-list Southern Baptist pastor of Dallas area megachurch, the Village Church, and head of the Acts 29 network. In one sermon, Chandler prays this almost imprecatory prayer. I mean, listen to this. Listen to this prayer. I'm going to read it, and I want you to just take this in as what it must be like to be a man sitting there hearing this. Father, for men in this room who prey on insecure women with wounded hearts, Father, I pray over these men a type of weight on their souls that would be crushing. Father, I thank you that you do not take lightly wolves hunting down your daughters. That it would be a day that these men, hollow-chested boys in grown-up bodies, would cry out as you come from mountains to fall, and that mountains would flee before your coming. I thank you that you are a just judge who will not handle lightly boys who can shave, who take advantage of your daughters. I pray that there might be repentance for these men for the salvation of their soul. Now, this is a good word, Matt. That's a good word for Matt. However, imagine doing the same thing in the opposite direction. It would never happen. Imagine if you were to hear an imprecatory prayer like this. Now let me read it. Let me say this again. The men who are doing these things ought to be condemned. It is good and right to call out these kinds of sins. But why do we only call out these kinds of sins and not particularly female types of sins? Girl world, as I call it, is a crazy place. And every woman in our audience and married men who have maybe sister-in-laws, who have wives, who have maybe a group of female friends, perhaps your wives work and they are in the workplace. Women who are in the workplace who are listening, who have friends, who have sisters, you know what I'm talking about. Girl world is crazy. It is a place of backbiting and manipulation and condescension. Girls who master girl world, I mean, there's an entire, think Mean Girls, but not funny at all. The world of Mean Girls really does exist. And I call it girl world. Now, imagine this kind of imprecatory prayer. Again, Matt Chandler's prayer is true, but tell me where this isn't true as well. And could you imagine seeing this kind of prayer, hearing this kind of prayer from an evangelical pulpit? Imagine this. Father, for the women in this room who prey on lonely men with wounded hearts, I pray that they would see the destruction of their manipulation brings. The women who seek out men in power, especially pastors, to seduce and destroy for nothing more than their own sanctification. I pray that for their own satisfaction. I pray that you not take lightly these black widows devouring men who might otherwise serve you, Lord. I thank you that you are a just judge who will bring to light their gossip and slander of other women in the workplace and in their own families. I pray that they would repent of their deception and cruelty for the good of their souls. This is equally true, right? Any of us who know anything about girl world knows that these are particular sins of women, sins that men a lot of times don't see and don't take part in most of the time. Would we ever see from the pulpit, an evangelical pulpit, a particularly woman-centered prayer or message like this on the particular sins women tend to engage in? It sounds outlandish, doesn't it? Watch. Contrast, let's go back to the Theopolis article. Contrast this with how Chandler treats women's sexual sins. In his famous Jesus Wants the Rose clip, and if you haven't seen that, please go look at it. It's just Jesus Wants the Rose, and you'll get it. It's very famous. Chandler describes how he's personally babysitting for a single mother who is actively having an affair with a married man, and how he becomes indignant when the pastor calls out sexual sin in this woman's presence. Not her specific sin, he didn't point at her, mind you, but just a sexual sin in general. Let's listen to Matt's Jesus Wants the Rose. It's about 3 minutes, and I think it is very telling as to how he treats these two different things. And I want you to hear it for yourself.
But it didn't take long before my passion for the gospel and my passion to see lost men and women saved started to rub against or collide with the church. And so it wasn't very long, and I can give you dozens and dozens of stories, but really one that kind of broke the camel's back, where I decided if I was going to do this, I wasn't going to do it as a churchman, because the church, more often than not, was an enemy of conversion and not its friend. I'll give you an example. This turn in me, this break in me happened that God has been just disciplining me on ever since. Occurred my freshman year of college when I randomly sat next to I'm a freshman in college, I'm sitting next to a 26-year-old single mother who's coming back to school to try to get a degree, never been to church, didn't know much about Jesus, didn't know, and so we began this ongoing dialogue about the grace and mercy of Christ in the cross. And so me and some of my crew go over to her house and babysit her daughter. She's actually in an extramarital affair at the time with a married man. And so we talk through that, the wisdom in that. This is the relationship we had, just kind of serving her and trying to explain to her spiritual things. A friend of mine was playing at a church in the area, and so I asked her to come. He was a musician, and so I said, hey, a good friend of mine's in a band, he's playing. Why don't you come hear him? And so she agreed. She thought it would be a concert. I knew better. It was shady. It was excellent. And she came with me, and we listened to Robbie play, and he was tremendous, just a real anointed guy. And then the minister got up, and he said, today I want to talk to you about sex. And so I immediately go, uh-oh, this could be a problem. And he took a red rose, and he smelled it, and he showed how pretty it was, and then he threw it out into the crowd. He goes, everybody needs to smell this. There's about 1,000 of us there, almost all of us college and high school. Smell the rose. I want you to smell it. I want you to touch it. I want you to see the texture in it. Do it, and I'm going to teach. And then he began what honestly, up until this day, and this might have to do with my heart, I'm still wrestling, was one of the worst, most horrific handlings of what sex is and what it isn't that I ever sat through. It was fear-mongering at its best. It was, you don't want syphilis, do you? And everybody's smiling and having a good time until there's herpes on your lip, and right? And so I'm just thinking with Kim beside me, what are you doing? What are you doing? And then as it wraps up, he goes, where's my rose? Where is it? Where's my rose? And some kid came up, the rose is just completely jacked up. It's broken, the things are off, the petals are broken. And he lifts it up, and his big crescendo, his point is to hold up that rose and go, now who would want this? Who would want this rose? And I remember feeling anger, like real, legitimate, I want to hurt him anger. And it was all I could do not to scream out, Jesus wants the rose. That's the point of the gospel, that Jesus wants the rose. That he made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. That while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Christ won. You're not even teaching the basics of our faith.
Now, I agree that the pastor's approach was inartful and crude. And fear-mongering and shaming people about sex is wrong. It's awful. It would make me uncomfortable too, because it's lying. It's lying. That's not the way that sex is. That's not the way unbelievers are going to be experiencing sex. That's not the way a lot of believers are going to be experiencing sex. And so to tell them that is to lead them down a path where they don't believe anything you have to say about anything anymore, much less Jesus. It harms your credibility when you're trying to bring them Jesus if you're going to talk about sex in this way, because it's terrible. I agree with Matt on that. However, what this woman is doing, the woman that Matt is ministering to, is actually morally wrong, what she's engaged in. And I know he believes that. But she's already raising one child without a father, and she's potentially creating another fatherless home with the adulterous affair that she is in. Fatherlessness is a huge indicator. I think it is the biggest indicator of all kinds of mental problems, emotional problems, for boys, especially whether or not they're going to end in jail, whether or not you're going to graduate from high school, whether or not you're going to be in the middle class or upper middle class. Growing up without a father is the number one predictor of all these horrible things we would never want to see our children go through. And so breaking up a family and raising a child without a father is one of the most harmful things you can do to children. I'm not shaming anyone who finds themselves in that position. I'm not telling anyone what their circumstances were or that their circumstances were unjustified. I don't know. I'm simply pointing out the truth of what fatherlessness means. And anyone, whether you're in that situation or you're on a pulpit, should recognize that situation, the situation that fatherlessness creates. Now, this woman is already raising one child in that way and perhaps causing another family to go fatherless. And what is Matt's response to her sin?
She's actually in an extramarital affair at the time with a married man. And so we've talked through that, the wisdom in that. This is the relationship we had, just kind of serving her and trying to explain to her spiritual things.
He kind of just goes, well, the wisdom of that, and I don't know if that's exactly right. And he kind of does this like, well, kind of thing. Well, the wisdom of, I don't know about that is kind of his response to it. But then when it comes to a male pastor who is potentially making her feel shame for her sexual sin, what is his response?
Who would want this truth? And I remember feeling anger, like real, legitimate, I want to hurt him anger.
He's angry. He's angry. He becomes angry over his bad rhetoric. But he never says anything about how actually harmful and bad her sexual sin is. He doesn't treat her as a responsible party that perhaps she needs a little bit of shame. He seems to have no problem shaming men. He has no problem shaming this pastor who did such a terrible job on the topic. He has no problem shaming men. But is he going to... if anyone tries to shame a woman for her sexual sin, he is very angry at that man. Tell me if I'm being fair. I think that I am. I think that I'm reading this correctly. I'm watching this correctly. You let me know what you think, again, in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If I've got him wrong, I'd like to know. This is always the case. Women are treated, from evangelical pulpits, women are treated like delicate flowers who are always the victims of sin and hardly ever, if never, the perpetrators. This is John Piper. The article goes on here. This is John Piper. He's discussing how he framed his opposition to women being allowed in military roles. Okay. If I were the last man on the planet to think so, I would want the honor of saying no woman should go before me into combat to defend my country. A man who endorses women in combat is not pro-women, he's a wimp. He should be ashamed. For most of history and most cultures, he would have been utterly scorned as a coward to promote such an idea. What cowardly men do we thank for this collapse of chivalry? Brown suggests, there are a lot of military people who think women in combat is a horrible idea, but it's career suicide to say it. In other words, let the women die. Now, I agree with John Piper about this particular policy of women in combat, but notice that how he frames it as in male cowardice. When Piper writes about this issue of women in combat roles, he assigns zero responsibility to women. He says sin tells women to become coquettes or controllers, But you'll notice he never actually says women do become those things. So he's not even acknowledging that some women want to be in control. This is, of course, true, but he never acknowledges that. In fact, he goes out of his way to talk about how brave women are, how capable they are, and he treats women in combat strictly as a result of cowardly men not wanting to fight and thus pushing women into their place. I mean, is that even remotely true? No. Of course that's not remotely true. But the point is that it's completely unbalanced. This is not the situation at all when it comes to the debate of should women be in combat roles. And now Piper is known to be a radical pacifist. So if one believes, as Piper does, that the Bible prohibits women in military combat, then shouldn't women who enlist themselves in these roles be sinning? He just doesn't say anything about that because that's not what we do in the evangelical church. We don't address women sinning. We don't give examples of women sinning. We don't discuss the particular ways in which women sin. We just don't do that kind of thing. And these are two of the most prominent, Matt Chandler and John Piper, doing this, and this is rampant from evangelical pulpits and publications. And I'm going to believe the author here when he says that he's read everything he could find by Piper on women in the military and never seen him assign any responsibility to women in this. Let's just leave aside the fact that is placating women and not treating them as equals, if that's what we're supposed to be doing. But it's just completely unbalanced. And I think that the author here, his description that the condemnations against men are utterly vicious as a gender, while doing contortions to avoid assigning any accountability to women for anything, it's very accurate. I see it all the time. And this is right. And this is a guy that's not a feminist. Piper's not a feminist. If this was a feminist, I would expect this kind of thing. But he's not. He's not a feminist at all. He's conservative as all get out. And these aren't anecdotes. He has a trove of examples like this, and I believe it. I believe it. That's true. I hear it all the time. So this is always how these kinds of things are talked about. And let's bring this back to Carl Lentz. The woman who he had an affair with, apparently, and are we going to ask this question, but I think it's obvious, was paid by the Daily Mail, UK Daily Mail, to air out all of the dirty laundry. And she did so in a fashion that I won't repeat here. And are we going to discuss her sins? Now, she's a non-Christian Muslim, but what we're going to do here now, what follows after this, is a discussion about the particular male sins of sexual aggression and how male sins can ruin a family, and all of that is true. But what it's not going to spur on is it's not going to spur on an investigation or any kind of hand-wringing about the particular sins of women who have sex with married men, cheat on their husbands or their boyfriends in order to gain companionship or other nefarious reasons. Some of those reasons are understandable, and it sounds like those two, the way she tells it, found comfort with each other in this crazy time of coronavirus. And she knew he was married, but still kept seeing him. Are we going to talk about how the data shows that women cheat pretty much just as much as men, that most divorces are initiated by women? That statistic doesn't really mean much, because even if the divorce is initiated by a woman, that doesn't mean it's their fault. But the numbers on how often women cheat, that gap is getting slower and slower. It used to be always that men did it more, not so much. And even then, the percentage isn't all that different. So what we're going to do is we're going to dunk on Carl Lentz and rightly point out his sins, but we aren't going to use this as an opportunity to discuss how women can be manipulative and conniving, and that they deal in these particular sins. Imagine for a second this scenario. A deacon or elder cheats on his wife. What happens? He is run out of the church, run out of town. People expect not to see him. People expect him to be gone, and all kinds of support is given to the woman and her family, the wife and her family, if they want it, and she is wrapped in a blanket of comfort and love. That would probably what would happen at most churches, and maybe that's good. I'm not saying that that's bad, but imagine the other scenario. Okay, we have that scenario in our minds. The elder or the deacon, male, he cheats, and how the church responds in both to him and to his family. Okay. Now imagine that the elder or the deacon, his wife cheats. What is that response like in the church where you are right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let me know in the comments below what you've heard from your pulpit about the particular sins of men and women. In the scenario where the elder or deacon's wife cheats, is it swept under the rug? Does anybody hear about it? Or is she vilified in the same way? Is he wrapped in a blanket of comfort and love? Is he expected to keep the children and she's expected to just go away in the same way if she was a man it would be? I don't think so. I suspect that the response is completely different. And is that right? Is that good? If the response is different, perhaps the first response is wrong, or maybe the second response is wrong. I don't know. These are the kinds of things that we don't talk about, we don't evaluate. Why is it that when men go to their churches because their wives have cheated, they don't get as much support as the other way around? I don't know. I think that evangelicalism has a particularly anti-male bent, and Carl Lentz is just another reason to talk about one of our favorite topics, which is to dunk on the particular sins of men and to dunk on men in general. Some of our biggest, best voices do it constantly, and it seems to me that only Theopolis is having this conversation where it is shoving men into the arms of secular role models like Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan, people who may have good advice and may have a good approach. I like both those guys, but they're not pointing people to Jesus, and they're not placing people in a church. They're not giving men what they really need, which is other good male role models around them. And maybe along the way, these men find that. They find groups of men that are good men that give them show them a way to go to be a good man. But I don't want to leave that out to chance. I don't want to shove people into finding pro-male areas in the secular world. I want to see men be supported in the evangelical church and not just dunked on all the time. Perhaps we're trying to make up for the fact that only men can be pastors in most evangelical churches. Perhaps it's men feeling sympathy for women. I understand those things. I understand those reasons. But I don't know, all of this kind of gives me the heebies, and it seems unbalanced to me. It seems like we're leaving especially blue-collar men out in the, we're leaving them out to dry. We're not giving them a place to be. We're not giving them a safe place to be where they don't have to be afraid of walking in any Sunday and getting dunked on by the pastor. I'll tell you what you think. Hey, leave me a comment underneath there. I'll try to respond to them, and maybe we can start this conversation as to how we should respond to these things. I don't think the response in the church to things like this with Carl Lentz, and these things are going to keep happening because they are for many reasons. I don't think that our response is healthy, and I don't think it's helpful to congregations and to men specifically. Well, I hope that was at least an interesting discussion. If it didn't ruffle your feathers a little bit, come check us out on Twitter, on Facebook, all the socials. Hit the subscribe button, hit the little bell so you get all the notifications, and become a part of our patron team and make this podcast better, help us to get cooler stuff, have a better presentation, and be able to do more things. See you next week.